Hi, y'all. Okay, we're getting started this week on your first essay assignment. I know this one comes up due pretty quickly in the term. I tell you what, these 9-week courses, they go pretty quick. So, um, I recognize that, and so I know that y'all are kind of probably a little nervous getting started and wondering kind of where to begin. And so I just have a few pointers for you as y'all hop into this first essay assignment. Of course, the first thing to do is make sure you read the assignment sheet and understand the basic formatting guidelines, the length requirement, which is at least 2 full pages. Two very full pages, really 2 to 3 pages to be sufficient. And just make sure to follow those basic guidelines, and there's some topic ideas listed there. There's also in Blackboard, you'll notice there's some examples of what I would call good essays, good analytical essays. So hopefully those will provide y'all with some examples of solid papers, what a solid paper would kind of look like for this class. But there's a few other little things that I think can be helpful here this week as you're trying to work through and write essay one. And so I just want to go through those real quickly with you. And then if you have more questions, you're always welcome to call or email me. But just a couple of bullet points, and then I'll go into each of these in more detail. The things you want to make sure that you're covering in essay one first, and one of the most important is the idea of a thesis statement. Thesis statements are critical in the papers for this class. It's also really important that they be what we call an analytical or an interpretive thesis statement. Okay. And we will talk a little bit more here in a second about what that would look like. Next thing to make sure that you're doing or not doing is don't summarize the literary text. Don't give a point by point of the plot. Don't offer a paraphrase of the story. That's not the purpose of this paper at all. And again, I'll discuss that in more detail here in a moment. Other two things, make sure you're integrating quotes correctly. Um, it's important to use quotes to support your thesis, but it's also important that you do that correctly. And lastly, make sure your paragraphs are linear, that they help your ideas to flow logically so that your paper is well organized and that it is building in sort of in a scaffolded way. Okay, now to kind of deal with each of those in a little bit more detail. First, thesis statements. You have an analytical thesis statement for this paper. It's not enough to just tell me about the story. It's not enough to make a few different comments about the story. You have to have a main analytical idea, an interpretation that you are trying to communicate to the reader. Okay, that is the purpose of this essay. And that requires two things. It requires that you be a critical reader and thinker so that you can analyze the story, work to get underneath it, to look at what's going on the surface of the story, but actually what is taking place underneath that. What is the author or the creators communicating through this medium of fiction or poetry or what have you. So you've got to be able to be a critical reader, a critical thinker, and analyze the story. Then you have to be able to be a critical writer. You have to be able to offer that sort of deeper interpretive idea about the story in writing. Okay, and a thesis statement, you want to compact that interpretation into basically a nutshell. That nutshell is like the nugget of your paper, the main message, and you want that to be clearly laid out in the introductory paragraph. So here's an example of a thesis statement on this play Oedipus, which is a play that you'll read later on in the term. But here it is. While on the surface, Oedipus seems to be at the mercy of fate, Sophocles very carefully uses language to show how human beings can and do have control over their own lives. After reading the text, what I see now is that our mistakes, our errors, can't be deemed merely accidental or fated. They are always in some way the result of our own hand. Okay, now that is a thesis statement that is offering an interpretation of the character of Oedipus. Okay, now this thesis is not something that everyone will agree about. Okay, there's lots of people who actually think the character of Oedipus really reveals how human beings are uh, victims of fate, that they are not responsible or in control of their destiny. Okay, but that's okay. A thesis by its very nature ought to be argumentative, it ought to be debatable. You're sort of taking a stand on something and then proving your point with details from the text. It doesn't mean everyone will agree on it, but it does mean that you have to support those ideas to the best of your ability. You have to be able to make a logical and reasonable, rational argument about why this particular view of this story or of this character, of this theme of the story, why it is correct. Okay, so that's really what a thesis does, is it offers that interpretation in a nutshell, and then you go and you unpack that interpretation in the rest of the paper. You support it point by point by point. Okay, now make sure that in addition to offering a thesis statement, that you then support that thesis statement with subpoints of analysis. Don't let yourself get sidetracked into summarizing the story. And I see so many students get confused here and go off track, but they end up paraphrasing the story or giving sort of a point by point summary of the story, and that just is not what this assignment is asking you to do. You have to do more than summarize, you have to do more than paraphrase, you have to do more than just comment on the story. You have to be able to interpret and analyze it. Okay, so remember not to summarize. I often tell my students it's almost, think of it as though we watched a movie and we watched it sitting together in the same room. And we finished watching the movie, and I turned to you and said, well, what do you think about this movie? What do you think this movie means? Or what do you think about that particular character? Obviously, since I just watched it, you don't need to tell me the movie. You don't need to retell the plot. You just need to offer an interpretation and support your interpretation with specific details from the film. Okay, so think of your essay in that way. It's as though we have both read this literary text. Now it's your job to offer an interpretation of it, but you don't need to retell the story to me or to the reader. Okay, so just make sure you're not getting sidetracked with summary. The next thing you want to make sure that you are doing is that as you are interpreting and analyzing the story, that you are offering support, particular specific details, relevant quotes. Don't quote sort of willy-nilly. Okay, some students do that. They just sort of pick out particular moments of the story and quote almost without a clear sense of purpose. Make sure to use quotes that specifically support the interpretation that you are offering to the reader. Point to relevant moments in the story, in the text, that help you explain your ideas about this piece of literature. Okay, um, don't don't overfill your paper with quotes. It gets a little bit tricky there. You want to make sure you're supporting your ideas, but don't overdo it. Sometimes I'll get students submitting papers and they're not plagiarizing. They haven't actually plagiarized, but what they've done is they've quoted and up to over 20 to 30% of their paper will be quotes. Okay, and you see what happens there is that you haven't actually written much of a paper if half of your paper is quoted material. Even if you've quoted it correctly, it still doesn't contain enough analysis. So make sure that there's a balance, that you are clearly using quotes to support your ideas, but that you spend more time developing and extending and explaining why those quotes are relevant than you do sort of weighing your paper down with too many quotations. Be selective, be specific. Don't feel like you need to quote even an entire sentence. Sometimes just a part of a sentence or just a small passage is sufficient. Okay, so just kind of be aware of that and try and create a balanced analysis where you're both using details and quotes to support your ideas, but you're not, again, sort of weighing your paper down with too much of it. And make sure that your ideas are still coming through, because that's what matters. That's what's important, is to be able to offer your reader an interpretation. um, you want to show your reader why you think some particular element of the story is thought provoking. So you have to kind of explain that. You have to walk us through that, walk us through your thought process in that area. And you use quotes to help you prove your point, but you don't want to just have quotes, because then we're kind of left guessing. It's almost like it's a dot to dot where you've never connected the dots. You just have quote, 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 and you've never really interpreted and analyzed and explained. Okay, so just be aware of that. Next thing, okay, we talked about this briefly, but paragraphs are the building blocks of your paper. And so just like your thesis statement is your main argument, your paragraphs need to contain topic sentences that are basically mini thesis statements that are offering subpoints that support your thesis in a very clear, specific way. A lot of times students have a sort of a vague sense of when to begin a paragraph, when to stop a paragraph, and you want to make sure that your paragraphs are focused on supporting the subpoints of your thesis statement. Okay, so paragraph with that in mind, that you want your paragraphs to contain the points, the interpretive points that are helping you to support that main thesis. So that subpoint would be contained in a topic sentence. You would go on to support and explain that subpoint. You'd use quotes. You'd explain the quotes. You'd conclude the paragraph and move on to the next subpoint. Okay. So just have a clear sense, a strategic sense of why you're shifting from one paragraph to the next. Make sure that it's, you think of paragraphs as links in a chain. They are the links that are connecting to one another to build this chain of supporting ideas for your thesis statement. Okay, so just be careful about that. And kind of the last thing I would say, just in tying it all together, watch your sentence structure. It's easy to get kind of sloppy with sentences. Sometimes it's hard to make sure that they are flowing in a smooth, clear way. Sentences have to be clear in order to be focused, to be concise. You want your paper to be readable and comprehensible, and it's great if you have these really big critical ideas, and a lot of times I can tell students are great critical thinkers, but a lot of times those critical ideas end up not coming through as well because their sentences are somewhat jumbled or poorly constructed, awkwardly worded. So just make sure to kind of go through your paper with a fine-tooth comb, sentence by sentence. Make sure your sentences sound the best that they can. I oftentimes tell students, read out loud. Read it out loud to yourself, because oftentimes your ear will catch what your eye can't. That, or grab your most critical friend, the person you know with the least amount of tact, and ask them to listen to you read it and make them point out to you places where they get confused or they think it sounds weak. They can be really helpful in that way. Um, be careful about using jargon. Don't use words you're not sure about. It doesn't make you sound smarter. It just sometimes makes the paper awkward or confusing. So, just speak as clearly and concisely, write as clearly and concisely as you can. Don't use words in writing that you wouldn't use speaking, or you're not sure that you would know where to use when you're speaking. Proofread, please proofread. I know that goes without saying. And last thing, just don't really just watch out for the plagiarism thing. Don't make sure that you're not using people's ideas without proper documentation. Okay? And let me know if you have any questions or any concerns. I'm always happy to help at any point as you're working through these assignments. Okay? I'm excited about reading. I really look forward to reading your ideas. This is my favorite part of teaching, is getting to see how students respond to different pieces of literature and how their writing really helps to grow their critical thinking skills. So I'm excited. I'm excited to see what y'all have to say in these first papers.